So good afternoon, everyone in Europe. Good morning to everyone in on the other side of the Atlantic, on the Western Hemisphere, and whoever has been drawn to the Asian East. That's probably good night or good evening. My name is Ruslan Stefanov, and I'm the Program Director and Chief Economist of the Center for the Study of Democracy. And I'm sitting in today, my pleasure and honor, for Mike Miklausic, our Senior Fellow who runs the CSD's Global Defense Dialogue. We have a series of really great participants. Previous was Ben Hodges, General Ben Hodges, and now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our today's speaker, Christopher Blattman, professor. He's a Ramalee Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy and author of the great book, Why We Fight the Roots of War and Paths to Peace. Mind you, this is not just on what's currently all on our minds, which are the big wars, but also the wars within our societies. So I look forward to this discussion. His research focuses on political economy of conflict and development, blending fieldwork, randomized trials, and policy engagement all over the globe. Professor Blattman is widely recognized for bridging rigorous academic research with policy debates, which is exactly what CSD likes. We build bridges between scholars and policymakers, our motto. He works on conflict prevention, peace building, and state fragility, making his insights highly relevant to today's geopolitical challenges in Europe and beyond. The idea of our dialogue is that we provide and we work together with our partners and with all of you out there. We work to produce actionable insights and decisions for our policymakers, which clearly face a more and more challenging work. The way it's going to work is we're going to have an exactly 1 hour with our great guest of honor, Professor Blattman. I'm going to start with a framing question, then we're going to lead the discussion with several more questions, and then half an hour, 40 minutes from the intro, we will open it up to questions. In the meantime, as we go, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat so that I could ask the questions that you put to Professor Blattman, and off we go. Professor Blattman, first of all, thanks for joining us today. And your work has shown that wars are not inevitable, but the result of political and strategic choices. Something we've seen that President Putin has time and again tried to shift the blame to somebody else. At a moment when Europe faces Russia's ongoing aggression in Ukraine and China's efforts to reshape global governance, how can your research on the roots of conflict help us understand the risks of escalation and, of course, the possibilities for building a more durable peace? Professor Blattman.
No, thanks for having me, and thanks for the generous introduction. There's maybe a few Americans in the audience, but for the others, we have a saying here. We say, we have a habit of paying attention to the dogs that bark, and we don't look at the dogs that don't bark. And I think we have to keep that in perspective when it comes to global conflict, because it feels like this moment of tremendous insecurity and risk, and it is. I don't want to diminish. And honestly, when I wrote the book and you finished writing the manuscript, I think it was 2021, late 2021. I don't think many of us thought we were going to be back in a world of great power conflict to the degree it feels today. What are the dogs that don't bark? The dogs that don't bark. India and Pakistan have had repeated instances of potential conflict, but of course, those conflicts either never happen or they're over within a few hours or a few days or a few weeks. We all remember what's happened in the past year, but just a few weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, India had accidentally launched a cruise missile at Pakistan, and nothing happened. And it was sort of buried on page A16 of whatever newspaper you read. There's dogs that don't bark with Russia. Russia has invaded Ukraine, but it hasn't resorted to war with virtually any of its other neighbors or attempted client states or or so forth. It uses every other means of its disposal, as any other great power does, to co-opt the politics there. It uses bribery and poisoning and covert support and all of these sorts of things. And so whether it's great powers or, small gangs, leaders are basically doing everything they can. War is the last resort. And the basic reason is simple, is it's incredibly costly. And so most of the time the dogs don't bark. And so I think Europe has a lot to, so it's an optimistic note at a less optimistic time. And so the book the book is a set of general principles. It's a set of general principles that help us understand conflict. It's not my ideas. It's 50 years, 100 years of social science, all the social sciences, and they all basically say the same thing. War is ridiculously costly. And the only reason we see conflict, and we could talk about the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we could talk about China's thankfully continuing reluctance to invade Taiwan. We could talk about my specialty, which is more civil war and criminal war. But the reason most of the time the dogs don't bark is as I said, because it's too costly. And so the book is about the 5 reasons that breaks down, and all of them, basically there's just one big reason that encompasses all the 5, which is that a people or their leaders ignore those costs. And that's basically what it boils down to. It doesn't happen often, fortunately. Not only do wars mostly not break out, but when they do break out, 50% of wars in history have been less than 2 months. And so we just have to be really careful not to overtune on this very, very long tail and unusual set of circumstances where we not only get large wars, but we get sustained wars, right? We need to understand them. They become the most important thing on the planet, but we need to understand just how unusual and exceptional they are. And the principles we apply to understanding them or solving them are not the principles that we should use for understanding peace and security in general, because they're so exceptional.
Well, thank you. I would really want to go into later on maybe on what's going on in our societies and how these two within and without our societies wars kind of are linked. But of course, as you mentioned, we are all now, and particularly everyone that's on the front line or there's a second line, everybody in Eastern Europe, we are looking at deterrence in Ukraine. So I would really want to hear your opinion of where do you think was the tipping point and why it happened. So there are all sorts of narratives. We're hearing President Putin's narrative, we're hearing President Trump's narrative. I was really fascinated by the sheer scale of lack of responsibility of China in that, how they can excuse that. But based on your research going forward, so not just looking backward, how can Europe and its allies design deterrent strategies that reduce the risk of escalation with Russia while still preventing Moscow from exploiting certainly a division within NATO? I mean, essentially, as we see it, any cessation of land in Ukraine is seen as a loss, and at the same time, Russia apparently doesn't want to let go of this war. So it looks like a forever war. I mean, from the current perspective, out of 3 days in the beginning, now it's like it's a stalemate.
Yeah. So I'll say 2 reasons stand out for me, and maybe just what I'll say as a preface is, what I try to do with the book, and what I try to do is sort of to give people an organizing framework to think about these things, and to sort of say that you said there's all these narratives, and you're right. There's a reason for every war and a war for every reason, and that's also true for why wars keep going. And I think what I argue, and I think what basically social science argues, is there's only so many types of reasons. So there's sort of five logics for why leaders and peoples overlook the costs of war. When you write a book and you talk to your publisher, you talk to a journalist, they say, well, couldn't it be 3? But, unfortunately, the world's a complex place. So unfortunately, we get 5. But in this case, I think I'm just going to highlight 2 that stand out. And one I call unchecked leaders, and the other comes from political economy, and it's called a commitment problem. And I think it's really, really important. Most scholars of war, historians, uh, game theorists, political scientists, a lot of them have argued that every long war is a consequence of these two things. What does unchecked leaders mean? We have an autocrat. We have someone who is not only not accountable for the costs of war, or at least many of the costs of war, doesn't personally pay those. So that's the first reason someone like Vladimir Putin, but any autocrat can afford to ignore the costs to some degree, right? Obviously, he feels them. But many autocrats have something personally or politically to gain. They can basically try to solidify their power, extend their power by doing so. And then more importantly, once a war is started, leaders in general, but autocrats in particular, face a tremendous risk from any loss, right? Any failure to achieve at least some minimal level of aims could end his political future, right? Or at least risks it. And so he has not only an incentive to launch this war, that some sort of private incentive, ideological or otherwise, but he has a powerful political incentive just to keep going because he pays the price. So, right, this war is not in the interest in Russians, right? This war and continuing it is almost solely in the interests of the ruling elite. That's very difficult to change, right? And so and no amount of geopolitics and very little of what outsiders can do can change that, unfortunately. And so that's part of the reason why this is unusual, exceptional, and tragic. The second is this idea of the commitment problem. And the commitment problem is in some ways simple, right? It basically says, look, we could put down our guns as the West or as Europe or as Ukraine and decide we're going to pause, right? But the larger power, right, is then has an opportunity to regroup and to retaliate, not to retaliate, but to reinvade potentially. And that and that absence of credible commitment and an absence of what we call security guarantees is a classic. So it's sort of a tired explanation for why this war won't end and why Ukrainians are fearful of settling even on generous or ungenerous terms, because they're worried it's going to restart. But I think it's important to understand that this underlies every long war. Think of I work in Colombia. Why did that war go on for nearly 5 decades? Right, the same reason that every civil war that goes on a long time tends to go on for years and years and years, because one side, usually the weaker side, has to put down their weapons. And then they're worried that the government or the larger part of society is going to persecute or exterminate them, right? And that's in some ways precisely what happened. Every time over the past few decades, the FARC entered into peace negotiations, either the government or some faction of the government tried to assassinate them. And when there finally was a peace with the FARC, and most of them put down their weapons, you saw something like 1,000 leftist leaders murdered per year over the last 5 or 6 years. But thankfully, that's died down. But essentially, you see a realization because the larger power has difficulty credibly committing because they have an opportunity to exterminate their opposition. And these are just tremendously, tremendously difficult challenges to overcome. And so those to me, stand out, not just in this case, but as a general principle for almost any long war you can think of at any level.
So yeah, this was kind of depressing in a way, but it was, I mean, in a way, knowledge always brings sadness. But in that respect, my next question, which was on China, which kind of pushes for a new global governance without, in our view, we've done quite a lot of work on China and Russia and the Kremlin playbook and looking at the interplay. And when you talk about commitment, and that also applies to the outside external powers. Like so far, with the end of the Cold War, we've kind of relied entirely on the US to solve such major conflicts. And it seems that the world's, or China or Russia, some of these people are already unhappy with the way the US has dealt with these conflicts. But now they also kind of lack commitment. They just cite the UN Charter and something, but what they're doing doesn't look like a UN UN Charter style, doing all these military parades and then saying we're in front of war and peace. Fine, but there seems to be a lack of commitment. And from your perspective, and what lessons, what can the West do in terms of from the lessons from your conflict research?
Mhm.
What's our next move? How can we engage? Is what President Trump doing the right thing? Was it more of the same that we need to do of what President Biden was doing? How can we engage China? Should we engage China? I know these are huge questions, but
Right.
the commitment part is particularly important.
Well, the first, I want to, I, on some sense, I wanted the first comment about this being, depressing. It's depressing in the Russia-Ukraine instance. I think it should be an optimistic and hopeful message because it sort of, I think it illustrates not only, why, I think to me it illustrates why I think it's relatively unlikely that China invades Taiwan and tries to take it over militarily, and certainly through an invasion of this nature, why I think it's profoundly unlikely that Russia would invade Poland or Balkan states. Um, Not only is this profoundly costly, but if Putin forgot, or if any leader on this planet forgot, that it's hard to exit these wars once you begin. And if anyone forgot that then there's a potential commitment problem that prevents long wars, they've remembered it now. And so before, I think most of these powers, great and small, tended to avoid these full-scale military conflicts. And for a period of time, we were in a sort of unprecedented time of global peace. And if that was forgotten for a time, I think it's now remembered. And so that to me is the best hope. If you're looking at something like China, and again, I just want to stress how I'm someone who brings general principles to these problems and not a geopolitical expert, least of all in East Asia. I study mostly in the Western Hemisphere and in Africa. I think there's sort of two types of answers. One is you were mentioning institutional level, and I'll come to that. But the other, I think, is just to think about how to make more profoundly the least, an even less attractive alternative than it already is. It's striking to me how until very recently, Taiwan was relatively complacent about its own self-defense and in terms of making war like an unattractive alternative. It was making what struck me as very unusual defense investments, big planes and big purchases of equipment, and rather than essentially this kind of sort of porcupine approach, which is just to make an already relatively not quite impregnable but very difficult to invade island even more difficult to invade, and then a place that's very, very difficult to occupy. A shocking for a nation, for a people that is that vulnerable to invasion, a shocking lack of widespread military training and involvement and things in society. So really, really striking to me. That's begun to change, is my understanding. And then secondly, I think the economic integration of China with the rest of the world was also very protective, right? It's not ironclad, trade and economic integration is not ironclad insulation against warfare, but it's a speed bump. It's several speed bumps. It's huge speed bumps. Economic decoupling from China strikes me as the wrong direction. You want, there are a bunch of I don't know if they're red phones or not. There's a bunch of phones connecting Xi Jinping to leaders of, titans of industry. And so more than the international institutions, right? Now, most of the time, I think Xi Jinping uses those phones to call those titans of industry and to tell them what to do to some degree and to sway them. But those phones also ring back, right? He has a broad political and business coalition that he has to maintain in order to achieve the very wide set of goals that he has, not just about Taiwan, but personally staying in power and pushing China in the direction he wants to go. And those voices matter. And if we systematically disempower or weaken those voices, then I think that's very important. So I care about these international institutions, but the thing is you don't need international institutions to overcome the commitment problem. You don't need international institutions to overcome these things. Usually war is just so costly on its own. These things benefit, but there are other levers. And so at the same time, we're either, I don't know, weakening or ignoring or at least failing to strengthen our international institutions, which is very hard to change, right? It's hard to improve that. There are some very elementary things we could be doing that arguably I think we're not focused on enough. And that's basically making Taiwan harder and harder and harder and less unpleasant to an idea to invade, and this sort of economic social decoupling, which I think is unwise.
That's very interesting because it builds on what we've done in the past, and I think in the case of Russia and China, the whole idea was with the opening of China and decoupling from the Soviets in the past was to actually through trade change them towards more democratic setup, which at this point in time, with their support for the war in Ukraine and with the clear bundle with Russia, which Russia sought very deliberately right before the invasion. So it looks like they're very much on board there. On that, they're building this global alliance. Looks like they're building this global alliance, saying, "Well, we want to be kind of counterbalancing the West." But what exactly? How exactly? I'm thinking, what could our next steps be? Because what we've seen in Europe already, and it kind of looks rationally, is the rise of economic sanctions. Trying to and these have not. We've done this clearly reluctantly. They are. That's why there's still a lot of debates about their effectiveness in shaping conflict outcomes. It's a mixed effectiveness, but at the same time, it clearly weighs in on the Russian economy because it's a huge economy with a lot of military expenditure. So it should be growing, but it's not growing anywhere near where a wartime economy would be. And in a way, all this put in perspective, it kind of looks like there are not many options what we could do more, because it seems that we're already there where it looks like on a path where democracies would be losing because we'll be accountable to our voters, whereas Putin and Xi Jinping won't be. But in terms of economic, in terms of sanctions, do you think you mentioned about China, keeping the red phones, but with Russia, the Russians shut them down, all those
Yeah.
red phones at some point. Do you think we should continue with the economic sanctions, tightening them further? I mean, CSD has done a lot of work on that, arguing that we should decouple from Russia and that actually this is our best choice. But you seem to disagree in a way.
I'm a huge proponent of sanctions. Usually I'm always impressed by the political and economic, the sophistication of the dialogue on issues in the press, and I think there's usually a lot of smart ideas out there, and the discussion of sanctions is it's just not true. To me, it's everybody's missed the obvious, because the object of sanctions is not the country or the person that you are sanctioning. The object of that is to sort of change the minds of all the people watching. And somehow we forget that. And we debate, oh, did sanctions work against Saddam Hussein? Well, he still did this. Like, are sanctions working against the Russian economy because the economy hasn't completely tanked? Like, that's beside the point. That's like the third most important thing we care about, right? The thing is did it cause tremendous pain to that individual, right? And is that pain systematic and predictable enough? That's an institution in some sense, right? Does every other potential invader on the planet look at this and say, I now believe that invading my neighbor or committing genocide against my people is going to be much costlier than I thought before? And an unpredictable, hazy, whimsical, should we sanction, should we not? Do we have do we have a predictable set of punishments? is the worst way because it's the worst way to signal to other potential leaders that war is going to be extremely costly. I like to point, because I work in criminal warfare, I like to make an illustration. There's a tremendous amount of violence in Mexico. The northern Mexican border and border cities are probably the most violent place on the planet by a factor of 3 or 4. We don't talk about this, but this is hugely important. There's wholesale slaughter of Mexican civilians, Mexican police officers, Mexican politicians. You would think there's almost no limits to what these cartels will do and on their violence. But if you think about it, and if you look closely, you'll notice they never kill Americans, right? They never kill DEA agents. They did once, I think it was about 25 years ago. And one group did. And the hammer came down. The hammer came down so fast and furious that they've never killed another American agent of the government again. And the Mexican government has done anything but, right? They engage in a whole bunch of repressive action and combat, but they don't draw red lines and punish those red lines swiftly and severely. And that's probably the worst mistake they ever made. And maybe, I don't know if it's too late or not, but it's certainly been 25 years of bad strategy. That's what we have to remember, right? Like, there's a very clear distinction here, right? And so sanctions are about drawing red lines, punishing the instigators for crossing those red lines. And then even if you don't actually succeed against that individual, everybody else notices and it changes their calculus in future.
We would trust in that actually to get the pain point at a level, and at the same time open up the red phone lines, to discontinue this conflict. I can see questions coming in on exactly this point about cartels and organized transnational organized crime. So we're going to come back later on. Please, everybody else, drop your questions in the chat or the Q&A, whatever you prefer. I'm going to try to look at both of them. But that links also to the another global strategy that we've seen in the case of Russia-Ukraine conflict, winning the hearts and minds, but also, kind of pushing countries. And it looks very much like Russia has been using also transnational organized crime, but also fragile states in Europe's neighborhood to pressure Europe, from the Sahel to the Caucasus. What does your fieldwork suggest are the most effective entry points for preventing violence in such contexts before they become international crises? Clearly the world's become much more uncertain and a warring place ever since the start of the conflict in Ukraine.
I started off talking about concentrated power and unchecked leaders. A mentor of mine is sort of a somewhat obscure African political scientist by the name of Amos Sawyer, who had the sort of unexpected, I don't want to say privilege, but difficulty of becoming president of Liberia when Charles Taylor launched his war. And then later went back to writing books when Charles Taylor eventually seized power. And this general point I made about unchecked leaders not internalizing the cost of war and thus being more ready to do it, but seeking, private and political gain from warfare, he said is the number one. I think it's the number one cause of conflict worldwide. He certainly saw it as the number one cause of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa. And most of these fragile states are ones with not only autocratic leaders, but ones with highly personalized power. And I think our medium and long-term focus in the continent has to be laser focused on this. We've seen there's sort of two directions this can go. And I think the rest of the world can make meaningful influence over this, especially because I think many Africans and African leaders want to do this as well, right? This isn't something that will be done to Africa, but something that many Africans want and many African leaders want. One is a degree of federalism within some of these larger countries. And we've seen Nigeria, Kenya, Zimbabwe, et cetera, move towards more federalistic systems. with outside encouragement and support. And I think that's been stabilizing. But I think harnessing these ideas of Pan-Africanism, which have been around for so long, and at the end of the day, these are very small, fragmented countries, right? I'm not sure how you're going to take a country of 5 or 10 or 30 million that's not particularly large and make it more federal and actually make it more stable. And frankly, that autocratic leader is probably not going to do it. I do think these sorts of Pan-African associations, whether it's the East African Union, whether it is ECOWAS in West Africa, there's a whole variety of these things that have the potential to be so much more than they are. There's virtually, and that's how I think we're going to get less centralized, less personalistic power over the long run. In the same way that Europe, eventually created the European Union. I'm not sure I see an African Union that's politically meaningful in the very long run, but I think these regional groupings, there's something in between that would be very stabilizing. And not only do we not talk about something like that, as I don't think it's enough of a conversation within Africa. It could be because there's a lot of popular support for Pan-Africanism. I think the outside community not only doesn't talk about it, but we actively undermine it in indirect ways. The World Bank and our primary lending and development organizations don't think in terms of regions. So it's very easy to get a road built with a loan from the World Bank from the capital to some outlying place. It's very easy to get a port built. Try connecting two countries. Try building a regional network. Try doing any of these things and try getting a loan. Absolutely impossible. We don't have the architecture we don't have and not only that, our development institutions empower these personalistic leaders because through the UN, these development organizations are mandated only to deal with them and their finance ministers and their ministers of planning. And so I think we could think about some large but not crazy and not unthinkable changes to the basic development and donor architecture that would actually, I think, incentivize more regional integration, economic integration that I think would over time evolve into political integration. And that's the only meaningful long-term path to stability I see.
That's a fantastic insight. Actually, this is what the EU has done, has been doing, or been trying to do. But I see the same pattern here. Also, regional has not been the strongest way of thinking, and I think this is particularly important for, closing these fragile states loopholes that Russia and China, everybody else will be trying to use, and probably also, but we'll come back later to that. Now, you seem to be, and thank you for mentioning also the World Bank approach. I think it's odd that we're not using actually the most credible example, which is the EU. I mean, which is based on the same premise, thinking federally or in groups of countries, diminishes the risk of them going to war.
Or the United States, right? Where it's in the name. it's
exactly
a bunch of states are united.
Going even further back.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's probably very interesting to follow through. On the limits of international intervention, you actually highlight the limits of external intervention ending the wars in your book. But again, going back to Ukraine, given the situation there and Europe's reliance on external support from the US in particular, and in the end of the day, the reluctance of European voters to actually commit resources, how should policymakers balance outside assistance with building durable local resilience? Have we done enough? And I see that also Lena Treguba's questions we're going to come later on. Have we done enough to strengthen Ukraine? Should we be doing something else? Should we be strengthening the eastern flank of NATO? I mean, just the other day, the plane of the European Commission president was jammed. Its GPS was jammed in central Bulgaria, NATO, a new member. Are we missing something, or are we doing enough and we're in the best of all worlds?
Well, yeah, we're never the best of all worlds, are we? I mean, I think look, Europe's to say something quite obvious, like Europe taking more responsibility for its own defense and increasing defense spending is long overdue, and I think makes the likelihood of escalation and invasion less likely. it's not zero, right? Putin has, has a personal and private and ideological goals that would include annexing more of Eastern Europe. Um, I think the job of Europe is to make that less attractive. I think that the commitment, unfortunately, a lot of that increase in military spending is coming at the expense of the thing that I focus on most of the time, which is foreign assistance. Whether that's saving lives or improving local security. I'd rather not see that trade-off, but if I were a European president and that was the trade-off I had to make and I couldn't cut back somewhere else, I would probably make it. I I think that and if Trump has done nothing else, he's done that. I think it's unfortunate. To me, the grossly unfortunate thing is not just the manner in which he's done this and other things, but I do think what's been undermined in the last few years to a degree is this idea of the unity of NATO and the impregnability of NATO. I think it was engrossed out prior to the invasion of Ukraine. I think Putin thought he might get away with it precisely because Europe and the United States seemed very uncertain. If you'd asked people to predict that not only with weapons support, but with political support and sanctions and every other way that Europe and the US and many other allies would come together and just act so concertedly. Not as far as some people would like, but nonetheless, it was not obvious that was going to happen. It's precisely this kind of uncertainty and disorganization and lack of obvious unity and lack of predictability that is dangerous. Right. And we are now, and after sort of reaching the pinnacle of that, in some sense, the most unity that this group of allies has probably showed in at least 25 years, if not in 75 years, we're letting that slide. Or we're not letting that slide. A lot of people aren't letting that slide, but unfortunately, the president of the United States is letting that slide. And that to me is profoundly dangerous because, again, it's not just about Putin. It's about everybody else who's looking and saying, oh, actually, maybe those sanctions and maybe that response and maybe this thing isn't quite going to be as painful as I thought it was going to be. And now that war, that invasion, this thing that I'm going to weigh against my political gain is maybe not so bad after all. I don't think we're there for most of these leaders, thankfully, but I do think it was the safest thing for the world was when we were at that pinnacle, and unfortunately we have not strengthen that because of, in part, the United States.
Thank you. That there's really a lot of insight that we would like to take forward. I think from that, including remembering the expectations and that we actually proved those expectations quite wrong, which means the costs of war to Putin has actually increased. And a final question before looking at the chat and the questions from our listeners and viewers. You mentioned a lot of lessons already. I think we're getting there. I think with all the difficulties in making the difficult choices we have, with the internal divisions that we face in all our societies, which is kind of normal, and we should remind ourselves that that we need to make those important political choices. But are there any other two or three most important? I mean, what would you chart out as if you had to do that memo for the for the Oval Office meeting, with the European leaders and President Trump? What would be these two or three most important lessons they should carry forward if they want to contain the current conflicts, and even more if they want to prevent the next generation of wars, because this is the big worry. I mean, Ukraine might not be the last one, and clearly there's been an escalation. We've seen Georgia, we've seen lots of conflicts in Africa, Latin America, but this is now a full-out war between major countries that were until recently part of a federation. So your two or three most important lessons. Thank you.
I mean, I think this to sort of, maybe I'll return to and elaborate a little bit on this idea of a predictable set of consequences for crossing red lines. Um, this is tremendously effective. It's hard to sort of demonstrate the effectiveness of drawing red lines and then having a highly predictable set of consequences for crossing them. And for that being institutionalized, not because there's maybe some formal treaty, although that might help, but could be even informally institutionalized in the sense that it's the architecture and the will and the predictability is there, even if it's informal. This is, as it turns out, the primary path to peace in cities throughout the Americas. Possibly the most effective policing strategy we know against violence. One that I think has helped for a long time to contribute to a dramatic decline in violence in American cities. One that's reversed, but for other reasons. And I think potentially the most important strategy in the Americas is this idea of of that draw red lines and punish the criminal groups that cross them. Some people call this conditional repression. In the United States, we call this focused deterrence. And all the evidence points to this being the most effective way for controlling violence in what are very violent cities otherwise. And I think the same extends to the international arena. And that's by institutionalizing that, you're sort of hitting all these things, right? You're changing the calculus of that autocratic leader because you can't change the degree of their autocracy. Like that's just not really up to us. There's not much the outside world can do to that. You can reduce the uncertainty around this, right? Because when, I didn't talk about this, but one of the other five is uncertainty. When this is just basic game theory that you would learn in your first year of a PhD, but you don't need a PhD to understand this. Because if you've ever played poker, right, that it's the uncertainty of the game that gives you the incentive to both bluff and call. If there was no uncertainty, it wouldn't be a very fun game, but no one would sort of bluff and no one would call. And bluffing and calling in war is tremendously, tremendously costly. And the more uncertainty you create, the more incentive there is to bluff and to call and to create all this violence. And so when we have an unpredictable focused deterrence or conditional repression or enforcement regime internationally, the less institutionalized and the more uncertain it is, will the United States act in concert or not, right? The more we're just escalating and creating that game of poker. All right. So not only are you creating a commitment problem, but you're actually creating the uncertainty that gives people the incentive to test it. Okay. And so making that as predictable as possible is very helpful. Unfortunately, several of these countries, Europe and the United States in particular, unfortunately, has acted inconsistently, not just in failing to do this, but through, I think the Iraq invasion fundamentally undermined America's I think fundamentally undermined this as well, because suddenly they were the aggressor and they were the violator. And I didn't think so at the time. I was an early supporter of the Iraq invasion. And I think in retrospect, for several reasons, that was wrong. But perhaps I think the most important one, which we don't talk about, is the fact that I think it did undermine, it's not so much that it gave permission and made Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping think, I can do this because the United States did it. I think it's more fundamental than that. I think it just undermined the notion that there are going to be a set of rules that are going to be enforced predictably. And if the main enforcer is breaking them, and that's the one big piece of foreign policy where I'm supportive of Mr. Trump, is he seems to just not want, for different reasons than me, but he's not looking to do that. And thank goodness.
Thank you. Now I'll go. That's tremendously insightful, and now I'll move to the questions in the chat. Olena Tregub, who's been doing a fantastic job in tackling corruption in Ukrainian defense, a very sensitive, of course, topic, says, and I'll bundle her question or observation with that of Vera Ivanova because they're similar. So Olena says, you mentioned that war is in an interest of the Russian elites only, but has not the war created the new middle class out of impoverished Russians, which means population is in favor of continuing war as long as the money is there. And Vera Ivanova then continues saying, Professor Blattman, could you comment the following reason for the war, especially Russia diverting attention from internal political and social tension to an external enemy? Do you see anything in that? So diverting attention to the outside enemy from Vera Ivanova, and then Olena says, and then this is all in equilibrium. They'll continue doing this war because the population doesn't care because they're already uh, well enough. New class, and there are just those that what very recently someone called the unneeded class. So people nobody cares about that are thrown in Ukraine.
Yeah, I don't think I know enough about internal Russian politics or economics to say anything specific. I'll say a few maybe general things that might be helpful. I'm lucky in that, I have two or three Eastern Europe and Russia experts along the hallway with me, including Konstantin Sonin and Scott Gelbach. And we were having a chat really on the day of the invasion, and of course, many days since. And what they said to me is they said, well, we don't really know what's going to happen, right? These things are inherently very difficult to predict. The one thing we know it will happen is that Russia is going to become dramatically less free and communicate and of course it wasn't a particularly free place to begin with, but the space for discussion and the space for dissent and the space for anything is going to shrink dramatically and at least permanently as long as Putin's in power. And that definitely did happen. It happened quickly and it's been sustained. So what Russians think and how people feel is even more difficult to ascertain than before. That's actually not just a problem for Russians. That's a problem for Putin. The core problem of an autocrat is that if there are not means for sort of measuring the temperature of people, and that's why elections and that's why social media use and things are actually often tolerated and encouraged to some degree within autocracies, because autocrats need signaling mechanisms to figure out when they push things too far. And so Putin's shut some of those down in his efforts for political control. Now, of course, he's had to build every leader has to build some kind of political coalition and create at least enough winners or at least enough delusion to keep the people behind them enough that they can hold on to power. And he's very good at this, and the people around him are very, very good at this. And so, yes, they've been successful. But the cost to ordinary Russians has been dramatic. Just think about the growth trajectory and what the alternative universe looks like for Russia in the absence of this conflict and for the average well-being of Russians. It's dramatic. My assumption is that people are not so controlled or deluded that they're ignorant of this. And I think that opportunity cost of the war is probably apparent to most, but maybe not. This is just outside my expertise.
Thank you. I'll follow up with two more questions about Russia and Ukraine, and then we'll move to the questions about transnational organized crime, and we'll finish on that. Thank you again for your patience. Now, Stefan Ralchev, a colleague of mine at CSD, says maybe the most eloquent lesson about reaction to a foreign aggressor in recent history was that what Churchill did in World War II, as opposed to what Chamberlain did. Had been doing before that. Why aren't we learning is one question, and I think this is really good to know. Have we learned, or are we really learning something? And then, in a similar way, Rosen Asenov asks. Will the EU investment in preparing for a possible war with Russia provoke an earlier Russian attack before the EU is fully ready, or will such preparations act as a deterrent to Russian aggression? I think this is mostly about your commitment thing, but could you comment briefly on these two?
Yeah, politics in peace is about concessions. It's typically about aligning the de facto distribution of power to the de jure distribution of power. And one of the reasons we mostly don't see conflict is because parties compromise. And when one party grows extremely strong, the weaker party is is in some sense forced to compromise. And that is the story of world history. That is the story of democratization. That is the story of one reason why 99 times out of 100, or at least 9 times out of 10, we don't fight. Um, and so, in some sense, Neville Chamberlain gets a bad rap because he was following the strategy that makes sense 9 times out of 10 or 99 times out of 100. And of course, it doesn't make sense in that 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 10 instance when making that concession emboldens and empowers an adversary like Hitler or potentially like Putin. And perhaps those are very difficult to predict. So I don't think we should undermine the rule that political compromise is the name of the game most of the time. Right now, of course, I'm a very liberal person in the sense of believing in freedom, right? And whether this country, which I'm born Canadian, but I naturalized American. I mean, this is a country that was founded on sort of ideological intransigence and a refusal to accept like a repugnant compromise. And Ukrainians are rejecting a repugnant compromise, and maybe the Taiwanese would as well. And so I fundamentally respect that. I'd like to think I would do so. There are certain principles that can't be crossed, and maybe that's what separates the 9 out of 10 and the 99 from 100, and that's when you stand up, that you draw certain principles. And maybe that's where Chamberlain went wrong. And that's what you can say about Churchill, perhaps. So I think that's the principal defense. But otherwise, I do want us to sort of really realize that compromise is fundamentally what we do most of the time. And that is how peace is going to happen in this case. There's going to have to be a compromise with Russia, recognizing that it is reasonably powerful, right? But there are going to have to be certain principles that are followed, and it's going to have to not be emboldening. And that's just proving very, very difficult, right? But most of the time it's not. That's the hopeful thing. We haven't had to do this on 100 different fronts because most of the time it's not difficult to draw those lines. It's this 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 cases like this that's very, very, very difficult to get this right. But that doesn't mean the answer isn't much easier for all the other 900 or 999 cases. And we need to be focused on that. Again, we need to be focused on all the things we're doing for the dogs that don't bark.
One follow-up question from Vihren Mitev, who asks about a sort of forgotten topic about climate change. Do you think it matters at all in the conflicts that we've seen expanding all across? Is the EU right about worrying about it or not?
Look, I think climate change is tremendously important for many, many reasons. I don't think it has a first or second or third, maybe a third order effect on conflict. And very indirectly, there's been a tremendous number of papers on this in economics. Generally, it's all very, very small effects, very, very hard to find anything. People trumpet the things we do find because that's what we like to do. But in general, the amount of variation explains is trivial. And I would say, if I lived in the Sahel, I mean, it's a problem because it's basically pushing farmers and herders into each other's faces, and people are moving around, and it's creating some scarcity and it's creating some opportunity. So there's parts of the world where I think this might be close to a first order determinant of conflict. But generally speaking, I think there's 100 reasons for us to want to minimize climate change, and I don't think this is unfortunately, fortunately, perhaps this is not one of them.
And now I'm thanks to Basir Rayet for listening and for waiting patiently, because his was the first questions, or the first sets of questions. I think these are very interesting and linked to your work also on a subnational social level. I'm going to read them because I think they're very very important. But I would really appreciate and like you to focus on the organized crime one, because I think you also see that he mentions that he asks whether AI or other high tech tools will lead to high risk seeking or thrill seeking behavior similar to high frequency trading. That's one. Also, I think that's a big topic we might want to leave out. But secondly, he mentions, and I think this is very, very important because we've seen this too, in particularly in creating loopholes in sanctions evasion. Drug cartels, transnational organized crime have shown the sophistication, motivation, and greed to evolve into quasi-state actor. Perhaps this is rooted in the 80s, 90s on both sides of Cold War, served as fertile ground. What kind of threat picture do you see in the coming decades? And has the EU and the US done enough to combat transnational organized crime as such quasi-state actor, or are we beyond that? Thank you, and we have like 4 minutes for that. Thank you.
Well, I'll skip AI only partly because things are changing so fast that I don't know, and I'm pretty sure almost every AI prediction is wrong. So why I'm not going to wade into that. I'll wade when it comes to look. This is the cartel. I shifted from working on civil conflict to organized crime a decade ago because I thought it was the biggest national security threat in the world, especially in this hemisphere. I still think that's true in the long run. Great power politics is taking our eye off of it, but this is the number one driver of homicide, certain in most countries, especially, and the number one source of homicide in this hemisphere in most cities. And look, it's very simple. The United States and the European Union consume a lot of drugs. That is a fundamental problem. And we outlaw those drugs, right? And it's not. I'm not necessarily an advocate for legalization, although I think there's a very strong case to be made for legalization of some substances, certainly marijuana and potentially cocaine. If you take something that millions and millions and millions of people want and you make it illegal, you are going to create a powerful, rich criminal sector. And what that criminal sector is very, very good at, or proving very, very good at over time, right? And it's only been doing this for about 40 years. And in 40 years, they've created monopolies and control that they don't compete with one another. Of course, they compete with one another, but they moderate that competition in order to keep prices very, very high and to enrich themselves. And so we're just putting a pipeline of cash into some of the most thuggish and disgusting people and organizations on the planet. And it's fundamentally our fault. And there needs to be, I think, a concerted effort to innovate in ways to reduce consumption, right? There's a shockingly little focus on this. It's very difficult. The number one thing I would do is I would have a massive, massive, massive research prize, just like we did Operation Warp Speed for the RNA vaccine. I would have a massive, 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 massive research prize for drugs that for like medical drugs that reduce addiction and that tackle addiction and the desire for drugs, just like we have for weight loss. I'm not enough of a biologist to know how feasible that is. It's definitely on my list of things to learn a lot about. Unless we solve the problem of either the legality or the consumption of these substances, we are going to continue to empower these groups. I was just in Rio. Rio is a mess. And many parts of the world, I think, are going to look like Rio in 30 years. Lagos is going to be the largest city in the world, and I think it's going to look like Rio with powerful drug gangs and high rates of homicide. All right. That's going to be very unpleasant for Europeans to have that closer on their doorstep. I think many other urban centers, I think Nairobi, potentially Mumbai, there are lots of places on the planet that could look very, very ugly and look like Rio in 20 or 30 years. And if I were a president or mayor in any of these places, I would be laser focused on making sure I don't look like Rio in 30 or 40 years. There's a lot that can be done. We could have an hour-long discussion about that, but nobody talks about it.
Thank you. I think it's important that we finish on that. And again, thank to Basir for the wonderful question. I think we could have such a discussion hopefully in the future, and hopefully we'll get this prize. But also, it's clearly this is a vulnerability that we've created and we sustain, and that Russia and China and whatnot, everybody will try to use. Professor Blattman, thank you so much for your time. We're finishing exactly 1 hour after we started. Thank you for the really great insights, and we look forward to working together to um, removing at least or making the lessons learned from why we fight, so that we do not repeat the same mistakes. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for listening in, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next Global Defense Dialogue at CSD in the near future. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.